Okay, this is my attempt to begin my first podcast, and I'm calling this podcast "A Citizen Speaks" for the reason that my name in Hungarian, name Polgar, Polgar in Hungarian, means citizen. Now it's a little bit more nuanced than that because it's a particular kind of citizen, but for the time being, that's enough. Um, and I want to talk about, I have different topics, different ideas having to do with culture, politics, the present day status of our, well, I don't want to be pompous, uh, culture, let's say, civilization. It's a little bit too uh, pig-headed to go that far. But there'll be some topics that relate certainly to politics and certainly to culture, some literature, and so on. Any topic that, of course, is interesting to the listener, because ultimately, why am I doing this? So I want to communicate with people. The first topic that I want to talk about is a speech that was made by Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary, in a place in Transylvania called Tasnádfürdő. So it literally means the baths at Tășnad. The name of the place is Tășnad. It is a part of Romania now, but there are a large minority of ethnically Hungarian or Magyar people that live there, and a little later we'll get into why. And for the last couple of years, except for the last two, because of this so-called pandemic that we've been subjected to by various powers, they didn't do it these last 2 years. So it was a big deal for them to start up again. And the interesting thing about this gathering, it's called an open university. And the interesting thing about it is that it attracts lots of different people from all over the world, because there are a lot of emigre Hungarians like myself who travel to events such as these and participate, trying to keep in touch with what's going on in Hungary. There are also people that come from Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, Slovakia, and anywhere else that anybody wants to come from. They could come from Ukraine or Russia if they want to. There's no limitation on who can participate. They also have people of various political parties. They're not just represented. It's not just the ruling party that Viktor Orbán belongs to that is represented. So that's important too. And the reason I picked this particular speech, well, partially because he has been invited and now has spoken at the Conservative Political Action Committee gathering in Dallas, Texas. He gave a particularly interesting and certainly passionate speech that many leftists, probably all leftists in the world, but particularly in the United States, were horrified by, and they've called him all kinds of names and everything. Of course, every media that deals in speaking only in cliches, of course, identifies him as a neoconservative or radical conservative or Nazi, whatever. They come up with whatever tag that they get from their bosses, the people that teach them their often very simple-minded ideologies. So the reason that this is important is because Viktor Orbán, and again, I have to point out the fact that I was born in Hungary and became an American citizen many years ago. I was 11 years old when I came here, so I've been an American citizen for most of my life. Therefore, I consider myself an American, first of all. The fact that I picked this Hungarian prime minister, who, by the way, I met many years ago when he was still the ruler of this small party after the fall of the communist regime in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Communist Empire collapsed in 1990, and I met him in 1991. Anyway, so the reason I picked him was because he is the only politician today in Europe that is willing to stand up and openly speak out. Political leader, not politician, because there are other politicians. Václav Havel, who's a Czech politician, also has always been, ever since the fall of the communist empire, has been an adamant defender of what we call conservative principles, which basically are principles that have to do with 18th century approach to government, economics, and so on. Again, it's a long topic that I don't want to get off on the top. But the reason that I picked him is because he is so unusual. All the political leaders, except for Poland, and of course Poland's leader is also pretty conservative, but because of peculiar reasons that you'll get into in a minute, he hasn't been as outspoken and loud in his attack on or his defense of these principles that he also shares with Viktor Orbán. So that puts him in an unusual position because he is now the bête noire of the European Union. The European Union is this sort of super state, or they're trying to make it into super state, that was created in the late 20th century, and its representatives, the leaders of the European Union, partially because of the leaderships in other countries, the countries of Europe, but also because the people that get elected there happen to be, for various reasons, left-wing socialists, social democrats, and some of them are just lightly camouflaged communists. Again, we'll get into what is the difference between socialist and communist. I don't want to belabor that point right now. So that's why I picked him, and that's why I think the speech is important. The speech that he made at CPAC, which anybody can look at, because all you have to do is look it up on YouTube or some social network that is carrying it, so you can get a pretty good idea in English, and he speaks a relatively good English. You can get a relatively good idea of what he stands for. But in this speech in Tasnádfürdő on July the 23rd, he was more detailed. So let me give you basically a thing that I wrote. I'm going to read it and give you the ideas of what were in this speech. So he outlined his government's position and the principles on which that position is founded at this annual Open University gathering in Tasnádfürdő. It's a yearly cultural and political gathering in Transylvanian ethnically Magyar citizens of Romania and their growing list of guests, including political and cultural leaders from Hungary, Romania, and other Central European neighbors. As he has on other occasions in these last few years, but particularly since his Fidesz Association of Young Democrats, that's the acronym for this party, Fidesz, F-I-D-E-S-Z. This party's overwhelming sweep of the last national election, with 2/3 of the popular vote, a feat unequaled since the fall of the Soviet Empire and return of free elections to Hungary. Viktor Orbán demonstrated his realistic understanding of his country's problems and predicaments on the eastern edge of the NATO alliance, bordering Ukraine. A little aside here, this 2/3 majority, 2/3 election, which of course all the left-wingers are attacking and trying to undermine and are accusing him of having weakened his opposition or put them in jail. It's not true. These things that they're coming up with, that he has somehow or other prevented his opposition from participating, it's not true, because most of Hungary's written and even much of its other media is still pretty left-wing. The state controlled television and radio are no longer as left-wing, because the state now is controlled by the Fidesz party, which is a conservative party. So they're not going to let the left-wingers take over the state-funded television and radio. That's kind of makes sense, right? But there are plenty of other radio stations and many publications. Most of the publications are still pretty left-wing. So, sorry, the computer went off for a second. So, 2/3 victory is an incredible feat, not just in Hungary. I think pretty much any politician, any political party in any part of the world would be absolutely astounded and edified if they get a fair election in which they get 2/3 of the vote. And by the way, as far as fair elections are concerned, the European Union, which is not sympathetic to Orbán and his party, and every Soros-funded NGO and all the other left-wing NGOs that are available, they went and observed the elections, and not one of them could find any reason to question its validity. That's pretty important. That's all available in publications. Okay, so this is just because, unfortunately, if you read anything about him and his party, the people that write it, and especially, of course, people in our media here in the United States, with the exception of the Tucker Carlson on Fox. I wouldn't trust everybody else on Fox, but Tucker Carlson has done a little bit of research and has been much more objective about Orbán in this interview that he did last year. But generally speaking, he will not be presented as a positive figure. So anyway, 2/3 majority. Let's get back to the topic here. So he presented a logical, factually based understanding of the dilemmas facing Europe and the world. Most importantly, he described the one way in which a country like Hungary has a chance of success and of survival in a Europe whose leaders have abandoned the remnants of European civilization and dragged the continent to an oxymoronically called multiculture. His description, sorry, I have to make some adjustments here. His description of Hungary's political and cultural dilemma was preceded by general comments about the decline of the West, contrasting Spengler's spiritual and demographic decline, bemoaned a century ago to the one today of a decline in material well-being and power. By the way, Spengler was a German philosopher who wrote the Downfall of the West. That was his book, The Decline of the West. The growing civilizations in China, India, and what he defined as the Russian Orthodox one, find it humiliating to adopt Western values. What a surprise. They have come to understand that they must modernize so that they can resist the export of a Western value system. Identifying Hungary as part of the West, he said, we have lost our dominance over energy sources and raw materials. These are now in the possession of Australia, Brazil, and China, which imports half the raw materials from Africa. He pointed out that the Chinese now have 5 times as much of the rare earth materials as the US and 6 times as much as the Russians. Now, it's important, again, a little aside here, why is he talking about raw materials? Again, for a European, especially Central European, this whole question of raw materials is familiar because in school and at many places at home, they learned that the First World War was largely started because of the control over raw materials. The various powers in Europe at that time and before the First World War had enormous territories where they obtained raw materials. England, of course, had it all over the world. It had the Indian Empire. It had various places in Africa, and it had many other places, Australia, and so on. So Canada. So there are plenty of much raw materials that they were available for them. The Russians had enormous raw materials they still have because of the enormous size of their country. The Germans, on the other hand, were extremely smart and well-educated and capable, but they didn't have a lot of raw materials. So this whole thing about raw materials actually is referring back to that time. The Second World War, in many ways, was just a continuation of the First World War. So this whole question of raw materials basically caused both of them. Okay, the ideologies and all of the stuff, of course, came on top of it. I don't want to oversimplify, but it's important to understand why he's talking about raw materials here. So, international politics have succeeded in smashing the attempt of Europeans, he continued, to establish their independence from America by creating a German-Russian energy axis. Again, back to raw materials. The new answer to the problem under the leadership of Germany was to switch to renewable energy. But this is expensive and will not occur without pressure from above, which is now being exerted on member states by the European Commission in Brussels. They have just released the proposal that every member state must decrease its gas usage by 15%. Though I do not know how they will enforce this, even though there's some German know-how. I mean, left from the past. The illusion here was lost on no one in his large audience listening patiently on an unusually warm day. Again, these people are Central Europeans. They know what Germany stood for, has stood for, even in its modern version, not at all anything like under the Nazis or any other of the previous rulers like William I, who of course was the Tsar, that's not the Tsar, sorry, the Kaiser who ruled Germany before the First World War. But Central Europeans know very well what Germany means in Central Europe. It's an enormous, and now, of course, all over Europe. Germany is the center of power in Europe. Anybody that doesn't know that just doesn't understand what's going on in Europe. So that's why he's talking about, German know-how left from the past. So the illusion here was lost on no one in his large audience. He even referred to the possibility that the Commission may try to take away excess gas from those who do not comply. He used the German word Einstand, literally meaning tied or equivalent, for the expropriation this implied. The importance of this German term is that in Hungary it is commonly used as in Ferenc Molnár's novel, The Boys of Pál Street, where the boys mean that the stronger expropriates whatever he may desire from the weaker. Now, for those of you who don't know who Ferenc Molnár, Franz Molnár, they used to call him in America, he had written many plays that became extremely successful in the United States on Broadway. And Carousel was the most famous one. They made a musical out of the play. But he is even better known in Europe because most of his novels and plays and even short stories have been translated into all the different languages of Europe, German, Italian, etc. And this story, The Boys of Pál Street, is about a bunch of boys who live in a modest, lower middle class area of Pest, and all the various vagaries they go through, the funny as well as the tragic circumstances of their lives. But everybody, all young Hungarians who still read, and Hungarians probably read a little bit more than other people do, they read this book, and certainly people Orbán's age have read this book and know what this word Einstein, how it's used in Hungary. So the Prime Minister's opponents disregarded the use of the term in Hungary and not bothering to do any research. They never do, right? Leftists don't do research. They just attack you. Attacked him for making an anti-Semitic Nazi joke. The absurdity of this misunderstanding and this interpretation was even lost on poorly read Hungarian critics who may be a lot younger than Orbán. Thus, since Orbán was at most ironic, they became the butt of their own jokes. After this introduction, placing Hungary into the European and world context, the Prime Minister provided Hungary's 5 main present challenges: demography, migration, gender, war, and energy economy. Those are the 5. The first of these is the oldest and most pressing problem of the decrease in Hungary's ethnically Magyar population, which he characterized as the number of burials are much greater in Hungary than the christenings. And by the way, it's not just the Magyar population. The Hungarian population as a whole has decreased, and nowadays everybody who lives in Hungary basically calls themselves Magyar because to them Magyar means Hungarian. And almost there are very few people in Hungary that can trace their genetic background to the ancient Magyars that first came to Hungary in 900 AD. Okay, so when we're talking about ethnic Magyars, we're not talking about people that are not mixtures of all kinds of different peoples, Slavic, Germanic, Magyar, and etc. So just to be clear that he didn't say anything about ethnically Magyar, I said it, but ethnically Magyar in this case is a lot more than just simply somebody who has still the genetics of the ancient Magyars who came to Hungary in the 9th century. So, though the situation has improved somewhat as a result of government assistance to new families, the change to increasing population numbers has not occurred. And if it doesn't, he said, others will replace us in the Carpathian Basin. And by the way, the amount of money that they give to small families and the tax breaks that they give them is pretty amazing. The government has gone to extreme lengths to help young families. Women who have 3 children don't have to pay any taxes. So there are lots of different things that they've done, and they give them large amounts of money, many thousands of dollars to help them establish and buy new homes and all kinds of other support. So it's not a small thing that they're doing, because they're trying to overcome basically somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 years of communist misrule, where the communists actually encouraged people not to have children. They were indiscriminately supporting abortions. So much so that the Soviet Empire had the largest abortion rate of anywhere in the world. They killed more babies in the Soviet Union and the countries that Soviet Union controlled than anybody had ever even imagined. So that's one of the things that they're trying to counteract. Because, of course, culturally, that horrible 70-year tradition resulted in many tiny families or no families at all in Hungary. Okay, sorry, back to the speech. His emphasis on christenings is often used by his mostly socialist opponents as exclusionary, even though he also uses the term Judeo-Christian to identify the tradition which goes back in Hungary to the 11th century and Saint Stephen, the country's first Christian king. Unlike his leftist opponents, he's never embarrassed about emphasizing that tradition with its complex, often contradictory applications of the principles of Christianity and Judaism. As someone who has taken the trouble to study the history of the politics of his country and its neighbors, he has pointed out correctly that the infractions and injustices committed by men in power cannot be ascribed to the principles that they have used to justify their actions. Just because there were Christian kings, princes, and popes who committed grave sins for which Dante assigned them to various circles of hell does not invalidate Christianity. By the way, Dante's little statue is right above me on the bookshelf there. The second, he continued, migration has divided Europe. One half consists of European and non-European peoples living together. This conglomerate of peoples is the post-West. The other half of the West, which has moved away, leaving the post-West, wanted to be allowed to live with those of its choice, but was rejected for this desire. Complemented by Soros, good old Soros, we call him Soros, Hungarians call him Soros, sponsored troops, Brussels now wants to force migrants on us. We were found guilty by a European court, and if the Ukrainian refugee crisis had not occurred, they would have begun to execute the court's decision. He was referring to the fact that Hungary was the second largest recipient of refugees from the war to its east, and continues to accept and help refugees from the war-torn country. These fine people in the post-West cannot wake up each morning infecting us with the threat that all is lost. We ask only that they not try to force this fate on us. The point here, which is understood and shared by all of Hungary's neighbors and even by many Europeans further to the west, is that the new socialist communist ideology gripping the West, which unfortunately includes elites in the US and the bureaucracies which run their institutions, is Spenglerian in the sense that it sees Western Judeo-Christian tradition as doomed by its faults and injustices. Some leaders throughout the West have tried to counteract this pessimistic outlook, since they understood that people cannot be led this way without positive goals and the hope that their efforts and good intentions will lead them to improve their lives and the lives of their children. Success is impossible. Orbán subscribes to the principles that Christian faith and its eternally valid moral foundation is the only basis on which the peoples of Europe can escape the mire of materialistic, nihilistic pessimism that has produced the monstrous ideologies of Nazism, fascism, and communism in the 20th century. That does not deny that other religious traditions also provide the basis for building optimistic and successful societies. It only emphasizes that Christianity, rooted in Judaism, which has formed the basis of European civilization for over 1,500 years, though attacked and challenged in the last century and a half, still may provide the basis for guiding Europe out of the pessimistic, hopeless quagmire produced by its horrific experiences of the last 2 centuries. Just a little aside here, and again, I will get into this at some other point. The reason that this is so pessimistic is because materialism, the foundation of all of these ideologies, so Nazism, communism, fascism, they're all based in materialism. Materialism is a approach to the world. I wouldn't call it a philosophy because it's not really very philosophical. It's an approach to the world that denies the existence of anything that has to do with the spirit of a man, of a human being. All it acknowledges is that the existence of a man or a woman or any other creature is simply tied to science, physical, mathematical, chemical, biological facts. There is nothing whatsoever spiritual that materialists accept. And a lot of scientists, unfortunately, not everybody, there are quite a few scientists that don't believe it, but a lot of scientists ascribe to it. They're the ones that are constantly talking about calling the boson the God particle and all kinds of stuff like that. So again, I don't want to go into it, but materialism is, if you study what that means, and one of the first people that understood that and saw it many years before anybody else did was Nietzsche, and that's why he said God is dead. He didn't mean it literally. He meant that in a European civilization, the Europeans have rejected God, and therefore he's dead to them. And now they're materialists, and that's what he was talking about. And of course, later on, unfortunately, what he said became a practice, and that led to the horrific misery and murder and slaughter of millions and millions of people. Okay, back to the topic. So he finally referred to the ideological trap that the peoples of Europe are of different races, pointing out that they may be of different nationalities and backgrounds, but in racial terms they are the same. He emphasized that Hungarians and those who agree with them do not want to create a mixed race population, but prefer to maintain the multi-ethnic character of the country. This quickly raised the ire of many Hungarian and other European leftist ideologues. The leaders of some groups who were not even remotely targeted by the statement made critical statements, tying the Prime Minister's assertion somehow to Nazi ideologues who expounded endlessly about race without any clear definition of the term. In Orbán's case, the distinction was clear. European peoples of various ethnicities, religious and philosophical convictions versus Africans, Asians, and others who come to Europe from their vastly different cultures and civilizations. His audience listening to him in Romania understood his meaning, and only the most misguided interpreted it to demean anyone. Probably not just misguided. He later admitted that the use of the word race was an unfortunate mistake, since he did not intend to create the impression that his opponents were so ready to attack. Faj, F-A-J, the word for race in Hungarian, is more nuanced than its Indo-European equivalents, since with different endings and in different contexts, it can only be translated by other words. For example, if you put a T-A on the end of it, because F-A-J-T-A, then it becomes fajta, which means type. And in speaking, the two words can be interchanged. Sometimes faj and fajta, you could interchange them. Nevertheless, it bears too many negative associations, the word faj, like so many other words whose meanings are tainted by misuse after the materialist past of recent past. Just in case anyone misunderstood his intention, he made the following comment about dangers. The Islamic world has come to understand that Hungary, especially with our non-Dorfarivar traditions, is not an appropriate thoroughfare for them to send their migrants. Although they are now coming from the south, there will be a time when we will have to defend our borders from the west and help the Christians escaping to us from there, though this will not be a task in our lifetime. Now, a little side here. The Hungarian name of modern Belgrade is Nándorfehérvár. That's what it was called. It's literally white castle at Nándor. Okay. That's the translation of it, literal translation of the Hungarian, but it became Belgrade, and today is called Belgrade. He's referring to a battle in 1453 in which Count John Hunyadi of Temes, the city of Temes, a fort captain and eventually a general in the above battle, defeated the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmet the Conqueror, who led the Ottoman takeover of Constantinople, which of course now is called Istanbul. Hunyadi fought the Turks, and his son Matthias, or Mátyás in Hungarian, was eventually elected king of Hungary. Like his father, he defended the country against the Ottoman Empire and provided the country with a hiatus of peace and prosperity. After he died, nobles whom he had kept in check during his reign managed to destroy the country's unity by leaving King Lajos II and his army in the lurch at the Battle of Mohács in 1526, and thereby opened the door for the Ottomans to take over a third of Hungary. Okay, so back to the speech. The importance of the statement with its allusions is that it appeals to Hungarians exactly based on the history they learned in their schools. Even though modern Islam is not a replica of the one practiced by the Ottoman Empire, an invasion of Europe is not led by turbaned beygs. That's actually an abbreviation of the Turkish word Skander Bey, Sanzak Bey. Sanzak Bey is a military governor or leader, but it's usually in Hungary and in other European countries that are invaded by the Ottomans. It's usually just called beygs. The fearful past, which in the minds of most Central Europeans, and especially those in the East, is associated with the interminable wars and battles of the 150, and in many cases more years, during which the Ottoman Empire ruled large swaths of their lands, is always recalled when any kind of that threat approaches from the Islamic world. This is the thing that comes to mind in not just the minds of Hungarians, but the Croats and Serbs and all kinds of other people in on the Balkans too, and Poland and even in Czech Republic and Slovakia. This is what is raised in their minds about the Ottoman Empire that ruled large swaths of their lands, is always recalled with any kind of threat that approaches from the Islamic world. For anyone not familiar in this part of with this part of Europe, this statement reads like an anti-Islamic slur, when in fact it is merely an expression of the fear and mistrust of people whose historical memory is filled with injustices too many to detail here. It's a topic for another podcast. The third challenge the Prime Minister addressed concerned the arguments about gender. We do not want to dictate to the West how they should live, but they must accept that for us, a father is a man and a mother is a woman. This is not an ideological question, but a biological one. This Western craziness will never gain a majority in this part of the world. We should not be fooled. There's a war which has caused inflation, and this has drawn a screen that hides our view of the arguments about gender. But the reality is that our world's fate is determined by the trio of energy crisis, migration, and gender. His allusion here to gender is to a referendum voted on by Hungarians and condemned by leftists. The question was, should children be taught any of the confused and mostly misleading ideas about gender in Hungarian schools? The voter response was an overwhelming no. I think the number was somewhere in the 80, 70-some% that said they didn't want to argue with it. I think it was close to 80, maybe even more. The fourth challenge he discussed was war. We decided a while ago that we will form a union with our neighbors. It was not an accident that the post-Westerners have done everything to smash the Visegrad 4, it is abbreviated as V4, and the war also shook Polish-Hungarian cooperation. He was referring to the Visegrad 4 agreement between Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, and economic cooperation with some political undertones, which succeeded in decreasing the competition between these four countries and creating a mini common market. The reasons for its creation, why only these four were included, are again complicated. But an importance of the effort was that for the first time in recent history, this group of small countries realized that the only way they can protect themselves against the much bigger and more powerful ones surrounding them is by cooperating, not by competing and allowing themselves to be used against each other. Had something like this happened in the 20th century, some of the murderous political events that so devastated these countries could have been slowed, if not totally avoided. We all want the same thing, he continued. We want the war to end, and we want democracy in Ukraine. However, our friendship with the Poles has been made more difficult. This is a matter of the heart. We see this as a war between two Slavic peoples, and we do not want to take part in it. The Poles, on the other hand, see this as their war. Our Czech and Slovak friends are trying to score points with the West. These terse statements hide allusions which are not necessary to detail for his Hungarian-speaking audience, but need some explanation. Poland and Russia have struggled and fought wars for many centuries, at times leading to Polish dominance of Russia before Peter the Great. That's the early part of the 18th century. In the 20th century, General Pilsudski, who was the first chief of state after World War I of Poland, succeeded in defeating the encroachment of the Soviet armies between 1919 and 1921, and thereby helped establish the first independent Polish state since the end of the 18th century, when they were ruled by Russian Tsars in the east, Prussians and Austrians in the west. Stalin's Soviet suppression of Poland after World War II, and the half-century of suffering that Poles endured is better known by even those unfamiliar with the area's history. As the summary indicates, Poles have no reason to trust Russia's leaders and will resist their attempts to gain dominance anywhere. The relationship with Ukraine is as complex as any that part of the world has known. The western part of Ukraine, much of which was part of Poland in earlier centuries, and some even between the two recent world wars, and has ethnically Polish minorities in cities like Lviv, with a history of Polish connections marred by the machinations of Russian czars and communist first secretaries. The Polish leaders sympathized with Ukraine because of the injustices they both suffered at the hands of arbitrary Russian power. I won't comment on his statement about the Czechs and the Slovaks. They have governments now who are much less conservative. They're a combination of different parties, coalition governments, and as Václav Havel pointed out, coalition governments never are successful because they can't have a unified policy, because every different party has different views and they pull them in different directions, and that's how the Czechs and the Slovaks are trying to mollify the European Western Europeans. That's what Orbán was alluding to there. So, addressing the sacrifices claimed by the war, The Prime Minister pointed out that in war, parents lose their children and children lose their parents. Referring to the 86 ethnically Magyar Ukrainian citizens who have died fighting in the war, he said, "Those who criticize us provide weapons while Hungary sheds blood." This is another sensitive subject seldom addressed by the socialist New World Order advocates in the European Parliament. After the peace treaty of Versailles, particularly the portion pertaining to Hungary, signed at the Petit Trianon Villa, Hungary lost 2/3 of its historical territory and somewhere around 3 million of its ethnically Magyar citizens. The largest number of these lived in Transylvania, a portion of the Hungarian kingdom ceded to Romania, and there were sizable groups transferred to Austria, Croatia, Slovakia, Serbia, Ukraine, and Slovenia. Fidesz, under Orbán's leadership, has accepted responsibility for culturally helping these minorities and has granted them limited voting rights in Hungary's elections. That is, those living outside of the country may vote for a party list rather than individual representatives, since they do not belong to voting districts. In fact, in the most recent election, the number of votes was somewhere in the neighborhood of 800,000 at the most, and out of the total votes cast in Hungary were around 3 million that for the Fidesz party. The 800,000 that ended up going, of course, to Fidesz because they couldn't vote for individual representatives did not make the difference in them getting elected. The other parties garnered only a third of 3 million, so maybe 1 million votes. So they couldn't have, even if they didn't have the 800,000, they would have still lost the election. Anyway, much criticized for their modest efforts to help these ethnic relatives who, under socialist communist rule, were simply treated as citizens of these countries to which they were consigned. In this war, Fidesz is most sensitive to the situation of the Magyars who live in the Ukrainian foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. There have been many disagreements between Hungary and the previous and the present Ukrainian government's treatment of the cultural and language rights of this minority. This has increased the mistrust of the Orbán government for President Zelensky, even though there's no shortage of sympathy in their ranks for the sufferings of the Ukrainian people, as demonstrated by all the help that they've given to the refugees and even to Ukrainians living in Ukraine. There are many examples of the Hungarians helping with doctors and other ways helping the Ukrainians. The 86 Hungarian victims of this war, to which the Prime Minister referred, are ethnically Magyar Ukrainians. This just brings the pain of their deaths closer to his audience, without diminishing Ukraine's enormous human sacrifice. We stand by our expressed opinion that this is not our war. Hungary is a member of NATO, which is much stronger than Russia, and for this reason, Russia will never attack NATO. The Ukrainian propaganda statement that they will not stop at the Ukrainian border, though understandable, is just not true. We are in a dangerous position, since we do not want the Russian authorities to feel that we, that is NATO and the EU, will become a party in this war. What was the reason for this war? He continued. It is important for us to understand why the Russians did this, although this does not imply that we accept their reasoning. The Russians provided their security demands in writing. Ukraine should never become a member of NATO, and it should never be provided weapons with which it could reach Russian territory. This was rejected, and now the Russians have resorted to the force of weapons to establish their aims. Now, again, a little aside. You have to understand, he, again, is saying something that to anybody who lives in Central Europe is unfortunately familiar. The history of Central Europe is filled with Russians responding to treatment by West European powers, or in this case, of course, the United States, with weapons. That's the way Russian leaders, whether they were czars, communist dictators, or whatever, well, there were too many different kinds, or now, of course, Putin, who just, where else is going to learn how to lead, except from his own history, they resort to fighting, and they resort to killing people when they don't get their ways, unfortunately. So everybody understands that that's what he's talking about. And here comes another interesting statement. This is aimed at us here in the United States. and people in Germany. If today Donald Trump were the American president and Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, this war would have never erupted. He thus positioned himself unequivocally against the present-day political leadership in both these countries. Listen to his speech at the CPAC. There he is a little bit more detail about why it's important for the United States to have leadership that is conservative, that is not in the hands of the leftists and the socialists and the billionaire money people that are behind them. Then the Prime Minister listed 4 strategical positions with which he has to contend. Ukraine can win the war against Russia with the help of Anglo-Saxon military trainers and NATO weapons. The sanctions will weaken Russia and destabilize the country's leadership. 3, those were the first 2, now the third. We shall be able to manage the effects of the sanctions. And then the last one, the world will line up behind us because we are right. He countered by pointing out that Russia has military superiority over Ukraine. Europe has become unstable. Governments are resigning. An enormous inflation is growing. And the world is not with us, meaning not with Europeans. He said that South America, Africa, and the Arab world and China have other problems besides this war, making it likely that the world is no longer one in which the West was able to achieve unity on solving problems. It hasn't been like that for a long time anyway. Since Hungary's military is not in proportion to those of the others, our GDP is modest. And though we see the overall situation clearly, there is no sense in maintaining the illusion that we can influence the war or the West with our good advice. However, it is a matter of honor that we urge the West to change its strategy so that rather than emphasizing a victory in the war, it concentrates on good peace proposals. Europe's responsibility now is not to take the side of the Russians or the Ukrainians, but to separate them. He emphasized that since the Russian response to more effective and destructive weapons sent to Ukraine is to expand the war to prevent those from being effective, there will not be peace talks between the two sides. Only Russian-American negotiations will bring the war to an end. Now, there's a little bit of an aside I have to make here. It's an interesting point that not too many Americans know about because American media does not report this. Monsanto and 2 other big agricultural companies, I can't recall the name of them right now, but the 3 American companies, but Monsanto is one of them. The other ones will come to mind in a minute. They bought 28% of Ukraine's agricultural arable land. Now you have to understand, Ukraine's land is the most productive agricultural land in all of Europe, and 28%. It's enormous size. Okay, some of it is in Russia, but an enormous amount of it is in Ukraine. These American companies, 3 biggest American agriculture companies, have bought 28% of that land. And why they were able to buy it, that's another story. But what's interesting about this is why. Why did those companies buy this land? What are they banking on? What are they counting on? Obviously, companies that are multi-billionaire companies, which have enormous lands in all parts of the world. Monsanto and these others have them all over the place. Why did they buy this land in Ukraine? This little sort of point emphasizes that when we're talking about, that's why Prime Minister Orbán is talking about that the only way that this war can be ended is that the United States and Russia sit down and negotiate. Because contrary to what we know here in the United States, there are enormous amounts of money and power in the United States that somehow or other are defending this war or defending Ukraine against the Russians, not caring about how much it's going to cost the Ukrainians, who, just to stay with the topic, Ukraine has already lost 10 million people to emigration. It's a country of 40 million. 10 million have emigrated. The Russians have taken over land that is going to take about another 10 million. So the Ukrainian population is now down to 1/2 of what it was before the war. The Russians are taking enormous amounts of land that includes some of the most productive industrial areas that used to be part of the Soviet Union. A lot of the industrial production was in that Donbass or Don Basin. It's Russian is for abbreviation. Don Basin is the Donbass. That's where it comes from. So what's going to be left? Even if let's say that the best of all possibilities, there's some kind of peace made, and the Ukrainians get to keep what they have now. The country is going to be a tiny fragment, at most 2/3 of what it was before, with a population that's half the size of what it was. Not too many of those Ukrainian immigrants, the 10 million of them, are going to come back. I mean, most of them were women and children anyway, so their husbands, if they stay there and they're still alive, well, maybe they'll bring them back. But again, you can't really count on this. This does not make it very promising to have a flourishing Ukraine after this war. End of the saga. He emphasized that since the Russian response to more effective and destructive weapons to Ukraine is to expand the war to prevent these from being effective, there will not be peace talks between the two sides. Only Russian-American negotiations will bring the war to an end. That's the point. I've just repeated it. Since the Germans and the French are not able to achieve adherence to the Minsk, we're not able to achieve adherence to the Minsk agreements, the Russians only want to talk to those who can enforce Ukrainian adherence to what they signed. The complicated situation it refers to is not understood clearly in the West, at least certainly not in the United States, not by the average citizen who is not well informed because we don't get the information from the right places. The Minsk agreements contain restrictions on the activities of both separatists in the Donbass and their Ukrainian opponents. These were not respected, and extremists on both sides were responsible for military actions that killed innocents and caused the conflict to continue. These were respectively supported by their sponsors, and to this day, there's no clear accounting of nor punishment for the crimes that they're accused of having committed. That's another thing that's terribly, terribly important and has to be taken into consideration when you're talking about why the Russians started this war. Fifth challenge, energy and economy. Those benefit from this war who have their own sources of energy. For example, the Russians, who though they sell less energy today, do so at higher prices. The Chinese, who are dependent on the Arabs for their energy resources, are now better off, since they can now buy from the Russians, thus eliminating on one side of the dependence. The Americans benefit since their energy companies' income has increased enormously. It's worth noting here that, like so many of his compatriots, the Prime Minister does not understand how benefits work in the U.S. He's probably oversimplifying it. I'm not saying that he may understand it, just oversimplifies it for his audience. Though he may not be exactly right in the other two cases either, again, probably oversimplifying. The increased energy prices have hurt the U.S. economy, and the much-touted profit of the energy companies is not as simple as his statement implies. Since the energy company profits must be calculated after expenses are deducted from the gross receipts, and the relationship between market price and profit is not linear. But again, this is a topic for somewhere else, some other podcast. Next, he asks who loses, and answers that it is the European Union, or Europe. The way in which this affects Hungary is that the government has had to introduce supports to dampen utility prices. They have done this by paying the difference between the market price of energy and the cost to Hungarian families, thus protecting them from the large increases. But then he had to point out that this expense has now reached proportions which the Hungarian economy, and by extension the government revenue, cannot meet. And we're talking about a lot of money. We're talking about as much as 500 to 1,000 and even more dollars a year of support to individual Hungarian families coming for the government. And there are a lot of people we're talking about, because there are 10 million people. Let's say there are 5 million households. 5 million times 1,000 is a big amount of money. Okay, and so that's what I'm talking about. That a lot of money is going to be going from the government to help maintain a lower price for energy for the population. I cannot guarantee, he said, referring to the price reports, that we will be able to continue what we have started. I just told you why. In fact, the government has already introduced supports whose magnitude is limited to the amount the average consumer uses. Any consumption exceeding this average will be at the market rate Hungarian energy companies charge. Because of long-term planning and prices negotiated with the Russians before the embargoes were imposed, Hungarian energy companies' market rates are lower than those of most European countries. This is something that, of course, they proudly point to as foresight. There's something to it. He also said that the natural gas consumption is to be reduced because the country is better situated to meet its electricity needs, having one nuclear power plant at Paks, and is in the process of building another one called Paks 2. Nuclear power, interesting sideline, which could have saved the German economy from what it's now facing because of this energy shortage. The German environmentalist party, called the Greens, came to power and made the government, were able to push the coalition, which consists of other parties too, Social Democrats and so on, but they pushed the coalition to close 10 of the 17 nuclear power plants in Germany. 10 of the 17. Had they not done that, they wouldn't be facing the problems that they're facing now economically because of the lack of energy coming from the Russians. So, interesting point about why in Hungary it's very important that they can have 2 power plants now and not just 1. He then addressed the likelihood of a recession in the Hungarian economy, providing a simple definition of recession as the economic performance of the present year being weaker than the previous one. He said that the present signs are that this will not happen in Hungary, although in other Western countries it will, leading to political instability. He separated the coming 4 years into 2 parts. The first 2 being the ones before the November 2024 presidential elections in the US, and the others after that. It is important to note how unequivocally he connects the prospects of his small country to the political and economic ones in ours. As he had mentioned earlier, the election of 2020 had an enormous effect on European politics in general, and because of Hungary's position and size, particularly on his country. He said that the outcome of the presidential elections in the US will provide the first opportunity for peace in the Ukrainian-Russian war. His audience needed no clarification on this point. But those in the US who have little idea of the influence of the vagaries of political decisions here should take note. We will stay out of the war, the gender madness, and Europe's general recession. That is good news. And we succeeded in 2010 as well as in 2020 to come out of each crisis stronger. We managed to pass other countries in a curve, but then we were drenched with a nasty downpour of sleet. Here he's referring to Hungary's ability to keep from recession after the Western economic downturn in 2008-2010, and then the pandemic of 2019 and 2020. He then projected that only if there is a new set of agreements negotiated between Hungary and the EU, negotiations about which are in progress, and then with the Russians, Chinese, and the US, will Hungary be able to achieve its earlier developmental course, the one preceding the emergency caused by the pandemic and the other by this war in Ukraine. He saw the problems of the West culminating in 2030, including a serious crisis in the US. The debts of Southern Europe, financed by the North, will impel the Eurozone to the epitome of its own crisis around this time, according to him. Since the Southern countries are unwilling to reform, new political forces will begin to dominate. This will be time when we Central Europeans will be paying more into the Union than receiving from it. The Czechs are close to this, and the Poles and we will reach this point by 2030. Since those who pay more can call the tunes, he concluded this will be the time when we must be at the top of our game when we will need military, diplomatic, and spiritual strength. He named 10 requirements for achieving these strengths. Number 1, we will protect our borders. 2, we are building a society based on the family. 3, we are modernizing and improving the technical readiness of troops, strength of our military. 4, we are diversifying our energy resources. 5, we are taking advantage of technological advances. 6, we are increasingly attracting foreign capital. 7, we are taking advantage of the possibilities of our situation as a transit economy. 8, we will preserve the political stability of our country. 9, we are establishing stable foundations, spiritual foundations, a world in which ideas, sensitivities, and culture are nationally based. And 10, we shall stay united and protect our national ambitions. A few details need clarification. 7, where he's talking about a transit economy, he's referring to Hungary's position at the eastern end of the European Union and NATO, and how that determines the nature of its economy. Most important are the last two statements, which are in drastic contrast to everything happening in Western Europe. He's pointing to Hungary not allowing itself to be subsumed into some European superstate, the misguided and largely unworkable process in which the West has engaged over the last decades, which has led to Great Britain leaving it. On this point, he and his neighboring states, politicians agree, even if the others are often reticent in confronting the EU. They are dependent on funds which have helped them in the last decades to overcome the devastating effects of Soviet domination after the war. Having had their national identity suppressed and negated by one form of brutal socialist order, they are unwilling to submit to another one, no matter how it pretends to be less drastic. These national aspirations are evident throughout Europe, even in countries which are stalwart members of the EU. The political trends in countries like Italy, but even in countries like Holland and France, indicate a growing dissatisfaction among large segments of European societies with the bureaucratic, centralized control of their lives from Brussels. When Orbán refers to Central European countries reaching a point where they are no longer dependent on the funds coming from the EU, but are themselves contributors, he's talking about this shift of emphasis. He's trying to position the small country in the context of the alliance of the Visegrad Four with Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, to be able to capitalize on the drift away from European centralization. The irony in relationship to his position on this question of national identity, again absolutely clear to his listeners, is that it is the antithesis of nationalism in a negative sense of competition with other countries. There's a sad history of nations in Eastern Europe discriminating against their citizens who are ethnically related to those of a neighboring state. This has at times led to horrible injustices and even genocide. That is an extreme which Orbán rejects by means of emphasizing the Visegrad Four. It is not that he is unaware of problems which will still exist in this regard for Hungary with Ukraine and Romania. He has shown that he's rational enough and understands that extremisms must be avoided at any cost. So he has done as much as anyone in the region to overcome conflicts about ethnic minorities. The sight of his speech and the cooperation of Romanian politicians in allowing it to take place shows that even the oldest and most contentious differences between Hungary and Romania can be negotiated between states which are members of the European Union. More importantly, it points to the one way in which a European confederation, not a union, may be workable. Rather than submitting the countries of the continent to a governing entity, I have to make some adjustments here so that I can read this. Sorry, it's a little bit of a break here. So, rather than submitting the countries of the continent to a governing entity like the one they have in Brussels today, they could be together for mutual defense, economic freedom along the lines of the original European common market, and resolution of cultural ethnic arguments between neighboring countries. The parallel with the US is unavoidable. The people who were behind creating the unworkable EU are the same political mentality as those who have increased the centralization of power in Washington. The problem in our country is the same. We need to allow the states to take back authority over problems that concern them uniquely. The ridiculous waste of money associated with a bloated government in Washington is parallel to the one in Europe and Brussels. We shall not solve our problems until we find a way to return the government to its legitimate functions of defense, representation of the U.S. in foreign affairs, and the regulation of interstate commerce, shorn of the accrued legal barnacles. Orbán also commented on his own age and his prospects as a political leader in an uncharacteristically modest way. He pointed out that since he was now heading into his 60s, unlike so many politicians in the West, he sees himself nearing the end of his political career. For this reason, he has included younger people in his government, most of whom are still in their 40s. To the degree he holds to this promise, he distinguishes himself from political leaders throughout the world. These are not usually people who are ready to hand leadership to others, no matter how much they insist on trusting them. And before I finish, there's one more comment, just to tie it back. When I first met Mr. Orbán, he was, being 17 years younger than I am, he was around 40, maybe even a little younger. And at the time, he was a junior politician, as junior as you could get, because he was the leader of the smallest party in the new Hungarian parliament that was formed after the collapse of the communist regime in Hungary. The way he became famous was he made a wonderful speech at the anniversary of the 1953 revolution, in which, in effect, they began bringing back and reviving the memory of the people like Imre Nagy and others who had been executed because of their leadership of the government during the revolution. Anyway, at the time I met him, I took him to see the vice president because he needed an interpreter, and at that time his English wasn't as good as it is now. And he was a young man, and like any young starting politician, he was ambitious, egocentric, and because of his short size, he had this sort of, appeared to me to be kind of a Napoleonic complex. And I sort of made jokes about his aggressive requests. And I wasn't that impressed with him. I must say, after now, we're talking about 32, 33 years, 34 years since this happened. He has matured into a sophisticated, extremely well-read, and unusual politician. The particular statement he said about his own getting to be old enough not to be the political leader of Hungary shows how he's gone from the kind of egotistic attitude that was required for him to go from being the leader of the smallest party in Hungary to being the leader of the party that now wins 2/3 of the vote in the country's election. It's amazing how he was able to divest himself and change his attitude and become much less egotistic and much more modest. And in many of his speeches, including the speech in Tasnádfürdő, he showed his modesty by being able to talk to the people in the terms that they understood directly. There are lots of comments that I can't translate into English. Things about the kinds of wine that they drink to quench their thirst mixed with seltzer water. Stuff that everybody in Hungary understands as talking to the average person in language that the average person understands. And he did not put himself on some sort of pedestal and kept referring to himself, like so many other politicians, unfortunately, in the United States and in other parts of the world, as I'm the one, I'm the leader. So it's very important that that kind of modesty is unusual in a person, especially one with this much success. But maybe it takes this much success to become that modest. So it will be interesting to see what he says in his speech. Now we can look at it, listen to it, so we know. At the CPAC, where next to Nigel Farage, the former leader of the Brexit Party in England, Eduardo Bolsonaro, a Brazilian congressman, he was the only European head of a government to address the gathering. That's the end of it. I hope it was interesting enough, and we'll see you the next time. Bye-bye.